Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads. I had the not-so-clever idea the middle of last month that I was going to do a Springathon wrap-up with hiking footage in the background, and then I shot 3 hours of footage, and apparently it takes me a month to edit that, so that's still not done. So I thought I'd jump ahead and talk about some more recent things that I was reading or listening to, and at the end of May and the beginning of this month I went through a phase of listening to a bunch of poems, which normally I do go to listen to poetry at readings in real life, where you have kind of a different experience because the person is there, and I read a lot of poetry, but I don't normally consume poetry on audio. So that was interesting, but I realized because I listen to them, I can't actually read from them. So I wasn't sure how I was going to do this, but I realized that because two of these collections by one author deal directly with structural racism in the United States, and another one kind of touches on the impact of that as well, that first of all, it would be remiss of me not to mention how the Black Lives Matter movement has been front and center in not just American news, in global news lately. I assume at this point that if you are so inclined, you have signed petitions. If you somehow missed that, I will link to the list below, but I assume at this point you've seen it. And if you've been able to make donations, I assume you have done that already. I'm not going to specifically talk about the movement itself, because as a non-Black, non-American, mine is not the voice you need to hear on that, and plenty of people have made videos on that, and you should go and watch those. What I am going to say is for other people who are also non-Black, non-Americans, you may have signed petitions and made donations, but if your first instinct after that was to say, we don't have that problem here, and whether that here is in my community, in my country, on my continent, in my religion, because those are all things I've seen people write, never mind just think, I think you need to think a little harder about the structural inequalities in your own country, because even if they don't map one-to-one to the racial issues in the US, they're definitely there, whether it's color or ethnicity or class or regional issues. Or it's an unfortunate fact of most human society that structural inequalities are there, and I think it's important to remember in our own communities and our own countries that we need to engage with those issues in addition to whatever happens to whatever is part of the global consciousness now, because this is, even to use Black Lives Matter as an example, this is a movement that has been ongoing for years, and even before that was the name of it. The movements and activism fighting against racially based structural inequality in the United States have been ongoing. We need to remind ourselves that things are happening in our own countries as well. We need to remind ourselves that these things are not exclusively an American problem, even if the problem is not specifically, it doesn't map exactly one-to-one, which I know is what a lot of people like to say and use as an excuse not to engage in local or national issues in their own countries, our own countries. So yeah, if you're lending your voice to the struggle in the US, make sure you're not forgetting about the struggles at home. Yeah, so also connected to books and this current situation, I have seen a lot of people asking for reading lists. And on the one hand, I think they should be able to Google, because there are lots of reading lists out there, and it's tempting to say, why didn't you care before? But if we're reserving judgment, I'm going to point out that a lot of those requests are very, very general. So what I would want to suggest is that if you are looking to learn, think specifically about where you want to start and what specifically you want to learn, and ask for those specifics if you are asking for suggestions. And again, you can probably Google, because I've seen people generically asking for recommendations of books by authors of color, or because it's Pride Month, books by queer authors of color. And that's great, but that is extremely general. And so to use an example, I'm going to talk a bit about 4 collections of poetry that I listened to the audio versions of at the end of May and the beginning of June, because all 4 of these collections are by queer authors of color. But I think a lot of people who are asking that book question, 1, aren't looking for poetry, and 2, are asking for a much narrower kind of thing, because the 3 authors of these 4 collections are of 3 different backgrounds, 2 different nationalities, and are writing in very different styles about different topics. So if you are actually looking for an educational experience or a certain cultural experience, you need to ask specifically for that. So, for example, Two of the collections that I listened to, Homie and Don't Call Us Dead, are by Danez Smith. I saw a lot of people sharing one of their poems on Instagram stories, which, if you haven't seen, I will link below. And they are a Black American non-binary writer who's maybe the kind of author that you would be looking for when you ask that question if you are looking for poetry, because their poetry does deal explicitly with being Black in America, and also with being HIV positive, and then a lot of other explicit social commentary. And interestingly, I had actually read Don't Call Us Dead previously in print, and I thought this was almost more engaging in audio, which isn't always the case for me. I generally prefer print to audio, but this was, I think, the superior choice. And as I said, I will link below to the one poem that was being shared a lot last week, but I think if you have the time and the inclination, it definitely worth your time. Don't be afraid of poetry, because this is very straightforward poetry. I'll also link below to a video that Bree Hill made recently that is in part a recommendations video, but she mentions one of Danez Smith's other books in which they comment on people's commentary on these earlier poetry, which was interesting. And then immediately prior to having listened to those, I listened to Tommy Pico's IRL. Tommy Pico is the author of my favorite, not just poetry collection, but book that I read last year, Feed. And Feed is essentially a sequel to this. These poetry collections are almost diary-like. The comparison that I make to people who read a lot of frontless literary fiction, these Ducks Newburyport tried to do more or less stylistically what Tommy Pico's poetry does. And I think Tommy Pico's poetry is more successful because it can do the same thing in 80 pages that book needed 1,000 pages to do. But yeah, I think it's just brilliant stuff. It is very, as I said, diary-esque, feels like a stream of consciousness novel almost as much as it does like poetry. Because I was mentioning how general some of those recommendation requests are, Tommy Pico is a queer Indigenous American writer. So I was going to say it's Indigenous History Month, but in the US it isn't. In Canada it's Indigenous History Month. I think in the US that's sometime in the fall. However, you should not just read Indigenous authors during Indigenous History Month. But in any case, you should read this poetry collection or listen to it. My point here is that I read the other collection, I listened to this one. They were equally brilliant in both forms. I found the print one to be a little bit more memorable, but that's just because I'm less connected to audio in general. I get more distracted listening to it, but they were brilliant experiences. The publisher has actually posted the entire audiobook for free on YouTube, so I will link to that below. And I found out that that was for free on YouTube because Ariel from She Wants the Diction mentioned this, and I will link to her video where she talks about it as well below. And then the first of these audio poetry collections that I listened to back in May was Dionne Brand's Ossuaries, which this is the kind of poetry that people who are afraid of poetry tend to avoid because it's very crafted, and there's definitely a focus on language other than, say, plot. Although there is plot in this. This is essentially fiction with a lot of classical and cultural allusions moving through, I was going to say space and time, not really space, but place. So you have different countries throughout time. You know, there are a couple of ways you could interpret the name. I was going to say this was maybe less for a popular audience, but people shouldn't be afraid of poetry even when it is more quote-unquote literary like this is. I definitely think it's worthwhile. I will say, because the language is so mellow and the narration was so mellow, all of these were narrated by the author. I don't know if I mentioned that, but yeah. And this is, because it's recited in such a mellow way, it almost felt like meditation, which I think distracted me from the fact that this does have a story. So I did have to go and look at the print version afterwards to actually figure out what the story was. Now, if you are less distracted when you're listening to audio than I am, you might not have had that experience, but I did think this was well worth it, but perhaps more challenging for for people who don't normally pick up poetry. And why does this tie into the recommendation comment, you ask? Dionne Brand is a Black Trinidadian Canadian lesbian. So again, this would fit that general question of, can you recommend me some books by queer authors of color? But again, if you're looking at social situations in the United States, you might not be looking for something very literary from a Canadian author, even though this does fit the bill. So yes, all of these books generically do qualify for that generically asked recommendation question, but I suspect that they are not all actually what people are looking for, or possibly none of them are what people are actually looking for, because I think a lot of the time people are actually looking for nonfiction history from Black American authors specifically. And I think if that is what you're asking for, it will help you if that is what you actually Google or ask people. But again, these lists exist. Anyway, that said, I do heartily recommend all of these. I thoroughly enjoyed or appreciated all of them. Some of them are, of course, about rather harsh topics. So do you want to say that you enjoyed that? I suppose you can say you enjoyed the lyricism, even if the subject matter was harsh. But my point is, yes, if you read poetry, read these. But if you're asking for a really generic recommendation based on demographic categories, you might want to narrow that down a little bit, just as a general suggestion. In any case, if you read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. If you are engaging in local community activism, I'd love to hear how that's going, which doesn't have to be protests. I feel like there's an impression that you either write to your member of parliament or your senator or whatever, or you're marching on the street, but there is so much else going on. In any case, that's it for now. When I have the time, I'm going to go back to editing that hiking footage. I hope you're keeping well, and yes, things are opening up places here, so that's a strange change as well. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.
This is IRL, written by Tommy Pico and narrated by Tommy Pico. I text Gerard, do you want to come over? Watch me stuff swim trunks into a weekender bag and maybe a movie? Regret is the gift that